So Neil, I've been riding with a few A-graders and they all seem to be turning their hoods in these days.
It's the latest craze, mate.
Yeah. Should I do that?
Absolutely. I think anything the pros do, we should definitely do.
Yep.
Yeah. No, look, in all seriousness, I've had a lot of people ask me about this, and this is one of the big questions we get in during a fitting is what's the pros and cons of turning the hoods inwards? So I'll run you through the pros and the cons.
Okay.
Because there's always downsides to these things as well as upsides. So should you turn your hoods in? Now there are situations where this is actually a really good idea. The obvious one is if your bar is 1 or 2 sizes too wide. If it's unnecessarily wide, you're not really going to ever have any problems having your hands a little bit further apart. It's never really caused anyone a massive trouble. If they're too close together though, that's where you can run into trouble with squeezing of the shoulder, the front of the shoulder here, can get a bit irritating. But if your bar is 1 or 2 sizes wider than it needs to be, turning your hoods in will mitigate that problem and basically narrow it down so you've got more of a parallel forearm position. Can actually be a good comfort thing if your bar is too wide. So if your bar is a little bit wide, give it a shot because it can have some upsides there. Number 2, if you regularly drop into an aero tuck where you're holding your hood in what I call a joystick position, which is where you're holding the top of the hood like this, this can be a really big bonus turning the hood inwards because it basically moves your hand from a really neutral position into a more pronated position, which brings this section of your wrist down onto the flat top section of the bar. So instead of having the side of your wrist touching the very edge of the bar behind the hood, you get a larger contact patch, in fact 2 contact areas, one in there and one on your wrist onto the bar. So you can rest your forearm on the bar better. So if you're a person who does this a lot, internally rotating the hoods or turning them inwards can actually be really good from a stability standpoint. Number 3, if you tend to suffer from hand numbness on the bike, some hand numbness issues on the bike have their root in compression of some of the nerve pathways through your forearm, through your flexor group in here. There's a bundle of little nerves which wrap around your elbow here and they go down into your hand and supply it with motor control, and they also take sensation back from the hand up towards your spinal cord and your brain. Any sort of compression of these and you can get numbness in your hands, right? So changing what we call the pronation angle of your wrist on the bar can sometimes relieve the nerve compression pathway through the flexor group. So I've had people where we've just tested this because there's no way of knowing without testing it, where we've internally rotated the hoods and suddenly all of their hand numbness problems have gone away. And it was logically therefore due to probably a nerve compression through the flexor group of muscles in here. So altering that angle can sometimes take the load off the nerve pathway in the elbow. So it's well worth trying if you've got hand numbness issues. Number 4, and this is deep down the list. This is probably the one that everyone wants to know. It is more aerodynamic.
Yep.
You know, it pretty much that's been shown in the wind tunnel to be one of the single biggest things you can do to your position to improve your aerodynamics. So if you are riding at high speed in the wind fairly often, it is well worth testing, and it's a really easy thing to test. It's probably the single easiest thing to test. You just got to undo 2 5mm bolts and just turn them in and crank them back up and go. So you know, if you want to save north of sort of 20 watts sometimes at high speeds, above 40-45 k's an hour, this can be a worthwhile modification. Now, let's talk about the downsides. So as with everything in bike positions, mate, it's yin and yang, it's up and down. There's some downsides. If your bar is already very narrow, with your wrists sitting inside the line of your hips and they're quite close together, turning the hoods inwards can further sharpen up the steering of the bike. So moving your hands closer together does make the front end somewhat more twitchy. And this is hugely individually variable with the length of the stem and the rider's position and the geometry of the bike and all of these things. But basically narrowing the hoods down does sharpen the steering a little bit. So if you've already got a bike which is a little bit shaky on the front end and you don't want it to be less stable, don't turn your hoods inwards. So yeah, it will magnify the effect of that. Number 2, if you ride very, very upright and your hand is coming in from a really steep angle down towards the hood when you're on the hood, this can actually cause trouble when you internally rotate the hood by basically giving your wrist a really awkward angle onto the hood. It's very hard to describe, but if you try it, you'll see what I mean. But people who ride very upright with their hand coming down on sort of a 45-degree pitch or slightly more, they don't tend to like this. If the wrist is coming in from a very low angle and the person is holding a low position and it's not necessarily horizontal, but let's say anywhere between horizontal and about 20 degrees, they will tend to like it more. And it's just due to the different wrist angles involved. So if you are a rider who's really upright, you might not like it. If you ride, number 3, if you ride out of the saddle a lot. So if you're doing a lot of climbing, as you get out of the seat, when the hoods are turned inwards, it's a bit strange. You just don't have the same level of control that you do when the hoods are further apart and when the angle is more in line with the drop, if you would like. So really severe inwards turn of the hoods can be a lot less pleasant on the hands for the same reason when you're climbing. Yeah, so keep an eye out for that. But those are the 3 or 4 sort of pros and cons. So you've got to weigh this up individually yourself. If your bar's a bit wide and you're running quite a narrow aero position and you just want to try it, give it a shot. Turn them in. I don't recommend like crazy turns in. You see some people with their hands 30 centimeters apart. I would turn them in a maximum of about sort of 34, 35 centimeters apart where your inflection point is of your hood. There are individual exceptions to that, but that's a good rule of thumb. Yep. So just get a tape measure and measure between them, and at the curvature of the hood where it kicks up, aim for about 35 centimeters for the average person. And if you don't get any downsides of it, mate, there's a little bit of free speed there to be had from the aerodynamics. So potentially not a thing that you'd want to do if you're really broad-shouldered and you've got stiff wrists and stuff. But yeah, for all those reasons that we spoke about there, it is sometimes well worth testing. So give it a shot. You can always undo it if it doesn't work.